Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 368 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is going to be a lot of fun. I love this one because it's going to be on what makes us laugh, the psychology of humour and comedy. And it's Saturday the 14th of February 2026 as I record this. So because I partly cover this in the psychology news section, maybe it might be Valentine's Day, but I don't have any plans. So today's podcast episode is so much fun. I loved it because I really do enjoy humour, comedy, and that's something that I talk about a lot more in today's episode. Like Mae Martin, they're an amazing comedian and I love them. But I also enjoy more deadpan humour, like from Nataro and the brilliant Sarah Millican, who does more sort of British, sort of a slice of life comedy, but all three of them are still hilarious. So I really do love a comedy, I love laughing, and I really enjoy comedy shows. But even though I really love a comedy, what makes these different situations funny? What makes the stories? What makes the different styles of a comedy humorous, fun, and just laugh out loud? So that is something that we explore in today's podcast episode, because we're going to be looking at what actually is a humour according to psychology. Because what I found when I was doing this episode was that what we think of a humour and what psychology thinks of as a humour is actually slightly different, and that's what makes this such an interesting area to look at. Plus, we also look at the different types of humour. How can we apply humour to the classroom, the workplace, the social settings, and so many more. Absolutely brilliant topics that you're going to flat out love. And we also look at the cognitive and the social psychological processes behind humour. So we learn a lot. It's a big episode, and I know you're going to flat out love it. So you got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and the first one is: virtual dates can be just as good as in-person dates. If you're considering going to a blind date this Valentine's Day, do you think it would be better to meet your date in person or via Zoom? Virtual work meetings and even online job interviews have become standard, and many of us socialise remotely too. But anecdotal reports suggest that many of us are skeptical of the idea that virtual dating could be a viable alternative to real-world encounters for forging romance. In a recent study in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, a team at the University of California set out to explore whether this is indeed a common attitude, and also if it's a fair one to hold. Their results add to a slew of findings, but when it comes to predicting how social interactions will go, we are often wrong. So, wow, there's a lot that I want to unpack here. So, first of all, the idea of Valentine's Day, I just want to mention though that if you are single for Valentine's Day, it doesn't matter. Sometimes I know that some people might feel lonely, like a failure, and anxious that they're single yet again for another Valentine's Day. But honestly, I would just say that it's fine now to be single. I actually quite enjoy being a single because it means I get to work on my projects. I've still got my friends, my family, and I've still got lots of other different and brilliant social interactions. You don't need a partner to complete you. Like, yes, I've been in two relationships in my life, and they've been brilliant. I've loved those people because they were brilliant, kind, and we had such a great connection. But I don't define myself by being in a relationship. So my point is though is that if you are single for Valentine's Day, and yes, I'm aware this podcast episode goes out after Valentine's Day, but you are still a amazing, interesting, and you are fine just the way you are. You don't need a partner to complete you. So, secondly, the second thing that I want to mention is that when it comes to predicting how social interactions will go, we are often so wrong. So, this is what I find interesting because our self knowledge is very poor, according to various social psychology studies. And this is the interesting thing about contact in interventions, whether it's about different communities, these are different social groups that were for example, cross-cultural and cross-racial friendship groups, people with the different religions, people with different identities, and so on. Though, because when lots of people I imagine interacting with groups that are dissimilar to their own, they tend to rely on stereotypes, and they don't like the stereotypes, so they think that the people are going to be bad, and the social interactions are going to go horribly. So if they're willing, and if the social interactions are encouraged, and if they're condoned by a society, then they're much more likely to be a positive though, so that's something that I talk about in my book, A Applied Psychology. So I think that the first takeaway from this psychology news section is that we ever find ourselves hesitant about interacting with a particular social group, with a particular person, let's take a step back and let's see if we're relying on stereotypes, misinformation, and most importantly, do we actually have a problem with that particular person, or do we have a particular problem with that social group? And if it's valid, then yes, I think that that's okay. But if it's not valid, then no, we need to be more mindful and more willing to actually go out and interact with those different people. And what I mean by like valid though, so for example, as a gay person, I would not interact with a far right person who's very anti gay and openly calls for gay people to be killed. That is someone who I would not interact with for my own safety. So it's that sort of like valid excuse. So that's something to think about. Secondly, so the idea of virtual dates. So going back to the actual whole point of this news article, this is my final point. Virtual dates. So for starters, I completely agree that the idea of a virtual date is not ideal. I find it quite impersonal. I find it like a barrier because of the screen. And I do know, though, that it would be really useful if I was more open to a virtual dates, because if I'm on a dating app talking to a guy and he's really far away, then I am much more hesitant to one, like the person in the first place, because I'm like, oh, how will this relationship work if it turns into a relationship, etc. But then I'm also more like, well, if we have to do virtual dates, then wouldn't this be worse and wouldn't it be not ideal? But also now thinking about it, I have socialized with friends before online, and it was great. I remember helping one of my former friends with a coursework over Zoom, and we were talking for hours. We were laughing. I was helping them, and it was great. And to be honest, like when I was dating in my first relationship, I did suggest a virtual date because it would be easier for both of us, and there were a whole bunch of like other reasons why a virtual date could actually be great. So to be honest, looking back, I have been willing to do it, and I don't actually see why virtual dates would be really bad, considering now that I do find virtual interactions are quite easy, very plausible, and sometimes they can be just as good as in person connections. So I think this is about broadly just being more reflective and just thinking, right, what are my preconceived notions? What evidence have I got to support them? But more importantly, what evidence have I got to disapprove them? So I've actually got a lot of evidence from my personal experiences, let alone this research, that shows virtual interactions can be positive and they can be lovely. It's just some food for thought. So the second one is, are they really listening? One clue could lie in their blinks. Blinking happens automatically, with the average adult blinking 10 to 20 times per minute, meaning as much as 10% of our waking time is spent with our eyes shut as a result. But research suggests that blinks also tend to happen at natural breaking points in attention. A recent paper in Trends in Hearing suggests that a person's blinking pattern can also change when they're focusing harder on speech. So there's not a great amount that I can say about this one, except from always try and pay attention when someone's talking, talking to you. And I definitely found though that after I did a validation podcast episode last year, the way I communicate with my friends, my family, and other people are much more intentional and they're much more thoughtful and with a greater self awareness. So, because like when my dad comes home from work, we tend to like have a cup of tea, we talk for like 20 minutes, and then like we go off and we do our different bits and pieces though. And in that time, yes, I would like to go on my phone and I would listen to him, but I want him to know that I'm listening to him. So I make sure that I don't go on my phone. I make sure that I'm looking at him, and I make sure that I've got open body language, and yeah, but like, just so he knows that I'm paying attention and I want to listen to him. So that's something, and that's nice. Plus, also, I focus a lot more on validating people, not only because of the different mental health benefits and the different benefits for our social relationships, as I covered in that podcast episode. I think it was last June or July that I did it. So, June or July 2025, I really do recommend that you listen to that episode. And the reason why I validate people is just because it makes them feel better, it improves relationships, and in my experience, it's such a critical part of having good, supportive, healthy social relationships. So that's something that I make sure that I do though. So I make sure that I say that, oh, that's understandable. Like anyone would have that reaction, and what you're feeling is completely normal. It's just something to think about. But going back to blinking, now, to be honest, because we're all talking about blinking now, we're probably all very aware of our blinking, and I know that I am as I'm doing this section. So I would just say that the entire point of this article is just make sure that we're paying attention, and let's just make sure that we're listening, we're enjoying the company of others, and our friends and our families know that we're listening to them, just so they know that we care about them. So maybe that's something that we can all continue to practice this a week. So the last one is, for intercultural relationships, those support matters the most. Friends approving of romantic partners matter. Research shows it's not just socially convenient, but also linked to relationship quality and even physical stress-free responses. Gaining that approval can be even more important for couples who are crossing cultural boundaries, where relationships may attract scrutiny, disapproval, or misunderstanding. Drawing on the data from over 750 people in intercultural relationships, A team egg explore those age approval matters most for relationship quality. Writing in social, psychological, and personality science, they show that approval from friends, family, and society matter in different ways for different couples, depending on the cultural background and their relationship stage. So I won't read into the article any more than that. But first of all, can I just say, saying the word those instead of whose, like whose support matters most, is so much more difficult. And yes, I know it's more grammatically correct, but as someone speaking this in audio, it's a lot harder. But anyway, so I definitely understand what they're saying about this social A approval because I remember, yes, I know this is a friendship example, but when I had a brilliant friend, amazing friend, love them to pieces, and I think that if certain life events didn't happen, we would still be friends now. But I also know that because we were teenagers, our social approval really did matter. And if people like friends, family, parents, other people, if they didn't approve of that friendship, then that really does damage the relationship. It makes it more difficult, it makes it harder to be friends because you're dealing with all of that to say approval and the stress that comes along with it. Whereas when it comes to my two relationships that I've been in though, so were full disclosure, both of them were amazing people. I love them to pieces. They were just brilliant, and I wish them the best in of their lives because they were so lovely, kind, and they were just amazing people. But I would also say though that social approval is really important in relationships because, like, my parents only ever met the second person who I was dating, and them approving of him was very rewarding, validating, and it was nice there because it really did remove a lot of stress that I had from the relationship because, because it meant that we could hang out whenever, it meant that they weren't questioning me constantly, I didn't have to deal with their disapproval, and I could just relax into the relationship, and he could come round whenever. So that was a massive bonus. That was really relaxing though. But I would say that my first relationship, that happened at university, because of my different people who I was living with, and their opinions of this particular person, and and a lot of other like social pressures, it was a bit more difficult. So I do understand this. It's a shame that we have to deal with this societal pressure and this disapproval, misunderstanding, and scrutiny. And if you're dealing with this, then I'm sorry that this is happening to you. I would say that your stress and whatever your feelings, they're valid, they're normal, and it's understandable for your situation. And I hope that over time things will improve and that you can overcome it. But going back to the heart of the article, so I've never been in an intercultural relationship, and because I'm not very too much in to this area, and because I don't have any personal experience to draw on, I would just say that it is difficult. I think that instead of enjoying the relationship, I think to some extent you are forced to fight stereotypes. You're forced to educate people. Yeah, and you have to do a lot more setting up, a lot more laying the groundwork and showing the people in your life that this person is important to you and they're lovely and that you want their support compared to other people. So something to think about. And I think that as a society, I think we've just got to be more accepting of intercultural relationships because it can be fun. Like it can be really fun mixing with other cultures, learning about different ways of life, and learning about different ways of doing stuff. And that's what I really enjoy cross-cultural friendships because they're just so much fun. It's just something to think about and reflect on. So I really hope that you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So this week has been a lot of fun. It's only been really productive. Been a bit weird, a bit weird in different bits and pieces. And I did have a break from educational psychology because I've learned a lot about education recently. I just wanted a little break, but I've also been learning lots of other fun stuff though. So whilst there's not a great amount that I can actually talk about in this personal update, just know that life is good. Working on lots of different projects. I had some really good news this week that a personal situation has finally stopped, and that stress has been quite a relief. It's been really relaxing, and it's been lovely getting back into reading and a bunch of other stuff that I've allowed to slip by accident. And in the next few weeks, I will be getting back to writing psychology books because they're a lot of fun. I do actually quite miss writing psychology books because recently I've been focused a lot on writing a fiction, having a blast of writing a fiction, but still though, psychology is where my heart really, really wants to go back to relatively soon. And next week it's half a term, so meaning that there's no school, so I can do even more projects, and it means that I can see friends and family. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode, so you can just email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi or leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. I always love to hear from all of you. It really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And always feel free to send pictures of where you're listening from. I always love to see where all of you are, all over the world. And today's episode has been sponsored by Personality, Psychology, and Individual Differences. This book, I'm so pleased with it, and it's such a brilliant sponsor for today's episode because one of the biggest determinants of a humour are different individual differences and personality factors like extroversion, conscientiousness, agreeableness. All of these have a massive impact on humour, and this is something that we talk about in today's podcast episode. But this book also goes into so much more than a humour and these big five personality traits, because it also looks at how else does our personality traits impact our behaviour, like the impact of our levels of religiosity, our politics, and so many more brilliant facets. We also talk about the Hexar model, which I probably said wrong, but it's a more European personality model, which I think is a lot better. It's a lot more interesting, and it's just brilliant. I love this book. It's so much fun to write, and this book, I'm really glad that I get to promote it because I love this book, but I don't always get a chance to promote it. So it's a lot of fun. It's really engaging, and you are going to love this book just as much as I do. So there's Personality Psychology and Individual Differences, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore, or local library if you request it. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, then now you can, at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems too, like Overdrive and Biblioteca. And whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. So as always, a massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you are wanting to continue. So if you want to become a patron of the show for the price of a coffee or a couples of a coffee a month and get access to tons of great rewards, including over 80 exclusive blog posts which won't be made into podcast episodes for weeks, months, or even years, then please head on over to patreon.com /The Psychology Word podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com /Conor Whiteley. So if that's enough the personal update, let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode, so we're going to be talking about what makes us laugh, the psychology of comedy and humour. So this is so much fun. I love this podcast episode. You're going to learn so much, and I know you're going to love it just as much as I do. So let's dive into it, and as usual, the content part of today's episode is narrated using my AI voice clone from 11 Labs. So I will see you on the other side, and please enjoy. Introduction to the psychology of humour. For decades, psychologists have wondered what exactly makes something funny, whether this is a well-timed joke, a normal situation that ends up making us laugh, or a weird accident that is embarrassing for one person but makes everyone else laugh. Why does this happen? Therefore, over the past few decades, psychologists have come up with a wide range of different psychological theories that reflect different perspectives to help us understand what makes something funny. One of the earliest theories comes from Freud, who had a few ideas about humour, then different theories have developed over time in response to the findings of various neuroimaging studies. However, more importantly, we need to understand that whenever comedy or humour happens, this is a very cognitively demanding task. Since our brains need to help us understand what the joke is, our brains trigger the emotional roller coaster that we experience whenever we experience humour, and our brains help us to experience the wide range of benefits of humour. For example, humour has social benefits, mental health benefits, amongst others. Personally, when my mental health used to be really severe during 2024, this was actually around the time that the Handsome podcast started, and in 2023, when I had a breakdown because of abuse and intense homophobia growing up. I started to get into Mae Martin, their comedy, and comedy was such an amazing break from all the psychological distress that I was experiencing. Even now, if I've had a tough day, if I'm stressed, and if I just need something to make me feel better, comedy is my first choice. Good comedy never fails to make me feel better. In addition, it's important to note that laughter, comedy, and jokes really do have social benefits. If you think about it, a lot of our friendships just wouldn't be the same without laughter. One of the reasons why I really liked my ex-GU, yes, that is a fake name based on one of our favourite Demon Slayer characters, was because we laughed a lot. We smiled and we were always joking with each other. And I think if you find someone you can joke around with, relax with, and just be yourself with, then that has the potential to be a wonderful relationship. Humour is a massive part of all friendships and romantic relationships. But why does this happen? That's something we're going to be exploring in the rest of the podcast episode. What is humour according to psychology? As psychology students and psychology professionals, we all know that psychology flat out loves a good definition, and humour is no different. Also, we need to realise here that what we think of as humour is different to how psychology perceives humour. To me and you, humour might be a funny joke, a funny head-shaking story, or a WTF moment, yet to psychology, humour is about investigating how and why do we find things funny, and what does this show us about how our minds and social interactions work. What are some psychological theories on humour? One of the earliest theories of humour, as I mentioned earlier, came from Freud. And before you automatically dismiss the theory because it came from Freud, I want to add my normal counter argument. Of course, Freud got a lot of stuff wrong, and I will not defend him because some of his theories were just wacky. Yet without Freud's ideas, we wouldn't be investigating sexuality, adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and a number of other fundamentals that are critical in modern clinical psychology. Anyway, Freud believes jokes allowed us to express taboo feelings or thoughts in a more socially acceptable way. This isn't a perfect theory because it completely fails to explain how situations are funny. It doesn't account for how social norms change the funniness of jokes over time and so on. But the theory laid the groundwork for several critical theories in the future. Another important theory in humor psychology is incongruity theory. This theory proposes humor comes from the unexpected juxtaposition of two seemingly unrelated ideas. Then the theory explains why we find wordplay as well as puns humorous, because they force our brains to make connections between disparate concepts. After we've made these connections, we experience a nice aha moment and we get the joke. Personally, I think this is another nice enough theory because it explains why we find wordplay and puns funny, as well as I can think of a lot of times when I'm having a conversation, someone else will say a completely random idea that isn't actually connected to my conversation, even though the other person swears it is, and this creates humour in the conversation. A final psychological theory of humour is the cognitive perceptual theory. This approach to humour sees comedy as a mental process that involves our perception of incongruity, then it is resolved in a playful, non threatening context. In essence, this theory sees humour as a mini puzzle that our brains work out, and the punchline serves as a satisfying solution. As someone who watches and listens to a lot of stand up comedy, I definitely agree with this theory the most. For example, in Mae Martin's Netflix comedy Sap, they tell a fun story about their parents apparently driving under a moose in their car before Mae was born. The idea of driving in Canada and a moose, they are not weird concepts at all. Yet add in the element about their parents driving under a moose, and that is weird. Then the punchline, resolution, and Mae playfully telling the rest of the story, that is a very good resolution that creates humour. Overall, the field of humour psychology has developed a lot over the years as our understanding of key psychological elements changed too. Since today, we understand that humour involves a wide range of emotional, social, as well as cognitive elements, and unlike before, we understand that the joke isn't everything in humour. The context the joke is told in plays a critical role too in creating humour. This is another reason why You Had to Be There explains why you can take the exact same event and tell them to two different audiences, and one will find it funny and the other will not. This is another explanation as to why the relationship between the comedian, the audience, and the cultural norms is flat out critical. For example, as a massive fan of Mae Martin, and I will shamelessly admit that they are attractive, I've listened to Mae on a lot of podcasts over the years. Once Mae explained how they needed to do a show in somewhere like Russia, but it wasn't Russia, and the social norm over there is LGBT, plus stuff is very taboo, it's criminal and it's outrageous. Yet a lot of Mae's comedy comes from LGBT plus stories, so they bombed as you can expect. This is because Mae's jokes were in direct conflict with the social norms of the audience they were interacting with, hence why there was no humour in Mae's set. What are the types of humour in psychology? Before we deep dive into the emotional and cognitive processes involved in humour, let's explore the different types of humour that psychologists can study. We need to understand this because each type of humour has its own style, distinctive characteristics, and potential impact on our social relationships as well as mental health. Furthermore, understanding the different styles of humour can be very useful for all of us because it can help us navigate different social situations, understand what is a good style of humour to use at a given moment, and what style you should stay away from, as well as recognizing your own humour style can be a powerful tool for self growth. Because if you recognize you're slipping into self defeating or aggressive humour more on that inner moment, then you start developing healthier, more adaptive communication habits, as well as you can start to use more self enhancing humour to build your resilience in face of life's stresses. What is self enhancing humour? Firstly, self enhancing humour is when you maintain a humorous outlook on life, even when you're stressed or facing adversity. A good example of this is when you're able to find the funny side in a frustrating situation or laugh at your own quirks. Research shows that this type of humour can be a powerful tool for personal growth as well as your own resilience, and people who are really good at self enhancing humour tend to have better psychological well being compared to people who aren't as good at it. Also, these people are better able to cope with life's challenges, and this humour style seems to be a defence against a decreased mental health. As someone who comes from a clinical psychology background, I flat out love this type of humour. I think it's brilliant that there is a way to use humour to protect your mental health, deal with the psychological stress in your life, and most importantly, foster a sense of resilience. This is something I would say I am rather good at because I can bully myself whilst making myself laugh very well. I remember joking with confused friends before who I didn't get my jokes, that I can easily entertain myself. Just something to think about. What is affiliative humour? Secondly, you have affiliative humour. This style of humour is the fun, warm kind that brings people together. For example, whenever you have inside jokes with your best friends, callbacks, and light banter, that improves the mood at family gatherings. These are all examples of affiliative humour. On the Handsome podcast, there are a lot of inside jokes, callbacks, and it helps to improve feelings of togetherness, and it forms the handsome community, as the hosts put it. In addition, affiliative humour is generally good natured, aims to amuse others without causing offence, and it's inclusive. This is why people who typically use affiliative humour are typically extroverted, enjoy better relationships, and experience higher self esteem. Personally, me and my family have a lot of affiliative humour because it's fun, it's great, and entertainment, and recalling funny moments when we make a funny mistake can create a nice moment as a family. There is one example involving evergreens that springs to mind, but I won't share that publicly on the podcast, as it wasn't me who's the butt of that joke. Yet, looking back at my own life, it's easy to see how affiliative humour is the social glue that makes social groups more fun, entertaining, and just lovely to be around. Social relationships without affiliative humour just aren't as fun. Finally, for this section, as someone who's previously worked with a wide range of different students, this is a form of humour I very much encourage, and I don't shut down because I want the students to banter, have fun, and have those great moments with their classmates. This might lead to more friendships, a more positive perception of a school, and these positive outcomes could lead to better academic performance. What is self defeating humour? I remember once when I was listening to Mae Martin, they were explaining how the main difference between UK comedy in US comedy is in the UK, there is a large focus on self-deprecating humour. This involves making fun of yourself excessively, as well as allowing yourself to be the butt of other people's jokes. Normally, this type of humour can be endearing, fun, and it can be very amusing for everyone involved, but you need to be careful about self-defeating humour. If you do humour style excessively, or take it to the extreme, then this reflects low self-esteem, and it could be covering up deeper emotional difficulties that you might want to work on with the psychology professional. Also, research shows that overusing self-defeating humour can lead to negative mental health outcomes and have a negative impact on social relationships. I think I have an example of this, even I acknowledge because this came from an emotionally abusive relationship, that this might be taken to the extreme. Yet because I felt weakened, that I wasn't able to stand up to this former friend, and I couldn't challenge that without my formerly severe mental health being blamed for why I was feeling a particular way. I used to allow myself to be the butt of their jokes, so my mental health history couldn't be used against me. Being the constant butt of jokes made me feel awful about myself. It decreased my self-esteem and made my already tenuous mental health even worse. Thankfully, that person is no longer in my life, and this is one of the great benefits. What is aggressive humour? The final main style of humour is aggressive humour. This is where a person uses humour to manipulate and slash or criticise others through ridicule, teasing and sarcasm. Whilst this can be done playfully, aggressive humour has the potential to create social tension as well as harm social relationships, because aggressive humour is a good example of why humour is a double-edged sword. Humour can be funny, but it can also hurt. This is one of the reasons why there are certain white straight male comedians that I just do not watch, because their aggressive humour shows a clear lack of understanding of the difficulties that other social groups face. Interestingly, research shows that women tend to appreciate and use aggressive humour less than men, and this could reflect broader gender differences in social norms as well as communication styles. More on humour styles and psychology. It's important to note that humour isn't a set category, and in most situations, people use a range and combination of humour styles. I'm sure that you've seen that in some of my examples. For example, Mae Martin tends to use a lot of self-defeating and affiliative humour because they focus a lot on bringing people together through comedy, often without realising it. Yet most people do have a dominant style of comedy, as well as Mae Martin has spoken openly about this, so I don't really see the issue with me rehashing some of it. Mae Martin's early use of a lot of self-defeating humour could have been a reflection of their poor mental health throughout their life. For example, their struggles with addiction as a teen and gender dysphoria, depression and anxiety as an adult. Thankfully, Mae Martin seems to be doing better now, as they explain on the Handsome podcast in January 2026. Nonetheless, this raises another interesting question about comedy. What are the humour styles that are less easy to define and categorise? What is dark humour in psychology? Me and my family are terrible for darkish humour, and this is one of my favourite types, depending on my mood, what the joke is about, and a few other factors. For example, dark humour jokes about immigrants, foreign people, and fascism I do not find funny, because to me these are real world issues and innocent people are dying. Yet tell me another type of morbid joke, and I'll probably die of laughter. For instance, there's a scene in The Big Bang Theory that I love, A character was signing what she thought was a retirement card, but it was a get well soon card because this person was in the hospital after a terrible car accident. So she wrote to name best of luck. You deserve this. Even now I'm smiling about that scene. Anyway, dark humour makes light of serious or taboo subjects, and this sense of humour doesn't fit into the four categories that we mentioned above. However, we still need to understand dark humour because it is critical for some psychological and social functions. Dark humour is very important in times of crisis as well as in high stress professions. Without dark humour, there would be nothing to break the tension, make the team members feel supported, and create a sense of togetherness. I will admit one of my potential flaws, which I am way better at now compared to as a child, is I am not always great in a crisis as perceived by other people because I laugh as a coping mechanism. But some people think I'm laughing at the awful news, at dire situations, or I'm being insensitive towards them and their news. Not always ideal. Anyway, the sheer diversity of humour styles that we have access to reflects the sheer complexity of human behaviour and our social interactions, since humans need to adapt their language as well as their humour styles to different social situations and audiences. Humour's flexibility is another reason why it is a powerful tool in our emotional and social toolkit. Lastly, to wrap up this section, I want to remind us why understanding different styles is important. Once you understand different humour styles, you can become more aware and intentional with your use. So, over time, these styles might become second nature to you. For example, if you're at an office Christmas party, a university social, or you're in the break room at work, you might want to use affiliative humour. If you and your team have had a hard day supporting clients, you might want to use self-enhancing humour, as well as you might want to use self-deprecating just slightly to show humility. Understanding humour styles and when to use them appropriately can help you come across as funnier, more empathetic, and more understanding as a whole, which in our profession as psychologists is flat out critical. What are the emotional and cognitive processes of humour? For a joke to be funny, we actually need to get it, understand it, and then the emotional response of humour and laughter needs to be triggered. Yet how does this happen? What makes something funny? What makes us laugh? This is what we're going to be focusing on in this section, and we need to start with our cognitive processes. Since whenever jokes and humour are being used around us, several cognitive mechanisms are happening in our brains to ensure we find it humorous or not. Firstly, the cognitive process of perception is important because we need to recognize that something is meant to be humorous. For example, we've had times when a joke has completely gone over our heads because we didn't understand it was a joke in the first place, we didn't laugh and find it funny. Secondly, there is incongruity detection. This cognitive process happens because our brain is always searching for patterns, making predictions, and helping the world to make ordered sense to us. Yet, when our brain detects an incongruence, something that humour typically uses, it catches our brains off guard. Thirdly, we have the cognitive process of resolution. This is because after our brains have detected the incongruity, our brains work out to resolve it. This is seen in everyday life as the aha moment that comes in that split second we finally get the joke. Finally, we have appreciation because if we successfully resolve the incongruity in a way that's pleasurable or satisfying, we experience humour appreciation. On a side note, I am a massive fan of Would I Lie to You? I only started watching it a few months ago, And for our international audience, it is essentially when a group of celebrities tell outrageous stories in a hilarious way and they need to work out if it is a truth or lie. And last night I was watching it. A subtle pun was mentioned. My parents got it immediately, but it took me a bit longer and I literally went aha when I got it. Moving on to the emotional side of humour, whenever we find something funny, we experience a range of positive emotions. For example, you might feel happy, surprised, amused, and sometimes you might feel a little bit of a delight at the really bad joke. I know when I hear some dark humour jokes about things that we shouldn't really say, whether this is in the workplace or in my family life, I feel surprised, shocked, and I'm really amused. It is these powerful emotional responses that humour triggers that gives humour an important and delightful role in our lives. As a result, you might believe that the relationship between cognition and emotions is easy to understand, because when we get a joke because of our cognitive processes, it should trigger a positive emotional reaction. In reality, the relationship between emotional responses and cognition isn't that straightforward. We've all been in situations when we understand someone's joke, but we don't find it amusing. I remember once near Christmas, in 2024, I believe, I was watching a so called comedy special with my parents. For context, they are two late 50s white heterosexual adults who are middle class. In the comedy special, the so called comedian was trying to make jokes about why transphobia didn't exist and why no one killed transgender people. The official statistics tell a very different story. I understood the bad and deeply offensive jokes he was making, but as you can probably tell by my tone, I didn't find it funny. Then there are plenty of less serious examples too. All in all, we can understand jokes without always finding them funny. On the other hand, we can find jokes hilarious without truly understanding them. One of the factors that can be used to explain this mismatch between cognition and emotional response in humor is surprise, since research shows that the unexpected twists in wordplay can trigger positive emotions, but surprise isn't always enough. The incongruity needs to be resolved in a meaningful and satisfying way to the audience. What role do individual differences have on humour? In psychology, we know that individual differences play a massive role in our behaviour. For example, in clinical psychology terms, two people can go through the exact same event at the exact same time, but because of individual differences in cognitive styles, attention biases, and child upbringing, they can have completely different behaviours after the event, such as a person developing depression after the death of a loved one and another person who doesn't. Individual differences also play a massive role in our ability to appreciate and perceive humour. These individual differences can include a cultural background, cognitive styles, and life experiences. Going back to my example from earlier, the reason I didn't find the no transphobia jokes funny is because, as a non binary person with a lot of transgender friends, I've experienced transphobia, hate, and I know people are murdered because of their gender identity. This is no joke. So, a white, straight, heterosexual man who knows nothing about transgender people making jokes about such a serious topic isn't funny to me. This is an example of how life experiences impact humour. Another individual difference that's important in a humour psychology is need for cognition. This is when people enjoy engaging in a complex thought. People high in a need for cognition tend to appreciate more sophisticated forms of humour more than people lower in a need for cognition, whereas people with a higher tolerance for ambiguity tend to find surreal or absurdist humour or entertaining. This helps us to understand why people differ in what they find funny. In addition, our emotional as well as cognitive responses to humour change over time as we learn, grow, and develop. For instance, if we think about stereotypes here, teenagers tend to laugh about sex jokes, and even sexually implied words like penis can make teenagers die of laughter. Yet, as the teenager learns more, experiences things, and develops into adulthood, these same words and jokes might not make them die of laughter. Overall, when we consider how important humour is in our daily lives, our social interactions, and how we cope with the stress of everyday life, this shows just how important understanding the cognitive as well as emotional responses in humour are, especially when we consider the wide ranging benefits of humour. What social and emotional functions does humour have? Besides from being fun, humour serves a wide range of important social and emotional functions. We'll focus on these over the next few sections. Firstly, humour is a powerful tool for social cohesion because humour can create a sense of belonging as well as togetherness in social groups. This is even more important in workplaces when the appropriate use of humour can ease tensions, boost productivity, and increase teamwork. And what I think is really interesting is that the type of humour that teams use can reveal a lot about their group dynamics. For instance, using aggressive amongst other types of humour can establish social hierarchies and exclude others. Like if you constantly make jokes at the detriment of a peer, then that peer might feel excluded from the team because of your humour style, whereas inside jokes can strengthen bonds within the team by creating a shared history and language with each other. All in all, this social function highlights the complex role that humour plays in our social interactions. The second major function of humour is stress reduction because when we laugh, our body releases endorphins. This improves our mood. Yet, humour has a psychological benefit too because when we laugh in a stressful situation, it acts as a psychological buffer that helps us to maintain our emotional health and gain perspective. Thirdly, humour improves emotional regulation because it helps us to process and express difficult emotions in a socially acceptable way. Some people compare this function of humour as the same as releasing a pressure vial in our minds, so we can tackle tough topics by making it look like a joke. This is probably one of the reasons why myself and my family can have very dark humour at times, especially around accidents, deaths, and scary experiences. When I'm nervous, I can strongly lean into these forms of humour because it helps me deal with the topic more effectively than without humour. This is another explanation as to why people joke about death and our own mortality, because humour is a strategy to help grapple with our impending death and limited time on Earth. A final cognitive function of humour for this section is humour can enhance learning and memory retrieval. Since humour can create links and unexpected connections between ideas. In turn, this can improve our problem solving and creative skills. So when we understand a joke, we're giving our brains a mental workout that benefits our cognition. As a result, humour can be a powerful memory aid when we're learning new information, as well as this is why a lot of educators incorporate humour into their teaching methods, so learners can remember a silly mnemonic device compared to the dull, boring lecture style method of some teachers. Personally, as an aspiring educational psychologist, this is very useful to learn about, and as someone who works in education at the time of writing, this gives me some food for thought whenever I teach, I don't always use humour because my brain doesn't naturally work like that. But I have seen how effective it is in teaching French firsthand. For instance, previously I worked in a class who was learning the weather in French, and the teacher made up a silly action for il pleut, which is French for raining, and the students automatically remembered the French word because of his silly action. Therefore, as an aspiring educational psychologist in the future, if I was trying to support a teacher to improve a student motivation and engagement in their lessons, I might suggest, in addition to a lot of other psychological tips, that they incorporate humour into their teaching. This is even more important when we learn that humour can capture students' attention, create a more positive classroom environment, and make lessons more memorable. Since you can use humour to maintain engagement, reduce anxiety around challenging subjects, and illustrate concepts to students. On the whole, this section teaches us how powerful humour is, and it's useful for navigating a wide range of life challenges that we are bound to experience at some point in our lives. Humour can help us to boost our creativity, cope with stress, improve our social relationships, and teamwork, amongst others. How does humour improve mental health? Applying humour in therapy settings. Of course, I need to stress up front here, as someone with a clinical background, please do not think I am going to suggest that you start becoming a stand up comedian with your clients. Do not do that. Do not try to make everything a joke with your client who is experiencing mental health difficulties. Yet, psychologists can use humour and laughter in therapy to help them decrease tension, to build rapport with clients, and help clients to see new perspectives on their difficulties. Personally, in my experience of counselling, some of my favourite moments was when I could laugh, joke, and smile with my counsellor. It removed the power imbalance. It helped to remind me that my counsellor is human like me, and they aren't a judgmental, uptight person who I needed to be guarded in front of. It's really, really helpful, and humour is an amazing tool like that. On the other hand, we have to remember that humour varies between cultures as well as different individuals within the same culture. This is important for psychologists because a great joke that relieved tension in your last therapy session might be offensive to your client after that one. This brings us back to an earlier point in this podcast episode. Always remember your audience and the context of the joke, such as, and to use a crystal clear example, if you have a client with severe depression and the trigger was the death of a loved one, do not joke about death. Another example of using humour in therapy is that in cognitive behavioural therapy, a therapist might use humour to help a client challenge their negative thought patterns, since a playful reframe or a well-timed joke might help cut through the client's cognitive distortions more effectively than logical arguments alone. As well as in a group therapy setting, shared humour can reduce feelings of isolation and create a sense of community. I remember a few years ago in a clinical psychology lecture, my lecturer was telling us how he's literally had clients in a therapy who have said to him, I understand what you're saying, and logically, my thoughts and fears make no sense, but I feel that they are. This paraphrased sentence shows us the power of our automatic thoughts and why they are difficult to change without professional help. Therefore, humour might be a useful way to overcome these difficulties. In fact, come to think of it, I'm pretty sure I've heard of a therapist or counsellor getting you to imagine your anxiety or negative automatic thought as a person. You make them look silly and you interact with them like they're a real person. It's something along those lines, and this does sound silly and a little humorous, but it is a useful technique. I remember when I was doing my cognitive and interpersonal therapy workbook for my anorexia, one of the exercises was to imagine your anorexia as a person, so you visualize the anorexic self, and it was useful. Anyway, a final way how humour can be used in the therapy room is by using humour in visual forms, like cartoons, to address mental health difficulties in a less threatening as well as more accessible way. In a way, this reminds me of the importance of social stories because these cartoons serve as a conversation starter with a client, so you can help people to articulate their feelings and experiences that they might struggle to put into words. Conclusion. At the end of this episode, we've learned a lot about humour and its psychological basis. We've looked at how cognitively demanding it is to get a joke. Then we've seen the great emotional and social functions of humour, from how humour reduces stress, improves our mental health, and how humour can help educators and therapists improve their work. Furthermore, our investigation of humour revealed the early Freudian and more modern theories of humour, as well as the importance of appreciating humour and the cognitive and emotional processes that humour relies on. This led us to realise the importance of surprise resolution as well as incongruity in humour. These elements all help us to create that aha moment and the positive emotional response that humour is famous for. Ultimately, I have to admit that we've looked at a lot of great topics, and I think this is one of those episodes that I'm going to keep coming back to, especially given how humour can be a powerful tool in clinical psychology and educational psychology to create a sense of belonging, togetherness, decrease barriers, and increase engagement. I definitely think I'll be using that information in the future. Speaking of the future, when it comes to the psychology of humour, there is still a lot to research, understand, and study, especially given the constant evolving nature of research methods, in particular neuroimaging, because these new and exciting research methods give us new opportunities to understand how the brain's mechanisms impact humour appreciation as well as perception. Also, there needs to be more cross cultural studies exploring how humour operates in different social and cultural contexts, so we can expand our understanding of humour even more. At the end of this episode, I want to leave you with a few simple questions to help you start applying this content to your own life. What is your dominant type of humour? Think about how you adapt your humour styles in different contexts, perhaps without even realising it. How could you use humour more thoughtfully in your professional life? Hi everyone, so human to me again. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. Like I know that I did because this episode was so much fun. It was really interesting to see how does psychology actually define a humour, but also how does psychology categorize a humour. So like a affiliate of humour, aggressive humour. What are the personality psychology factors and individual differences, and also gender differences, to be honest. Then it was really interesting to learn about like need for cognition and the need for closure, and how the different cognitive psychology and social psychology aspects impact our enjoyment and our perception of humour. So I learned a lot. It was brilliant, and then it was also really useful, but to me as an aspiring educational psychologist to actually see how could I use humour in the classroom to improve lives. So a lot of fun. I really did enjoy this episode. And if you know anyone who will enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. We're really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, please check out Personality Psychology and Individual Differences, available from all the usual places. And if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Conor Wiley, or if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis for the price of a coffee or two a month and cancel any time, then now you can at patreon.com/The Psychology World podcast. And finally, I always love to hear from all of you. So please reach out, tell me your thoughts and feelings. I would love to start a conversation. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.